Good evening. I am Abby Cherner. I serve on the Women's Philanthropy Board and am co-chairing this evening's event with Jeannie Milbauer. Thank you for joining us tonight. I am delighted that nearly 500 people have registered for tonight's program. A few housekeeping notes first. Tonight's session is being recorded and closed captioning is available, and you may submit your questions throughout the evening using the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. Tonight's program is the second session of a three-session series that explores the Black experience in the DMV area. For those unable to join the first panel, we heard from Reverend Tim Warner and his children and godchildren about their experiences growing up Black in Montgomery County. Federation knows that in order to have a vibrant Jewish community, we must engage, support, and embrace all members of the Jewish community of Greater Washington. Federation's 2017 Jewish demographic study showed that 9% of Jewish households in the DMV have a person of color in it, a number that has been steadily increasing. We have come to understand that the survey methodology we used likely resulted in a systematic undercounting of Jews of color. Given this new information, we can at best only make an educated guess about the population of Jews of color in Greater Washington. Tonight's session will focus on the Black Jewish experience. We are honored to be joined by three distinguished panelists who will offer their thoughts and insights as we continue building our collective understanding of the role of race in our community. To lead us through the conversation tonight, we are thrilled to welcome Yolanda Savage-Narva. Yolanda recently began her national leadership role with the Union for Reform Judaism as Director of Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Prior to this new role, Yolanda advised Federation in its racial equity work and was Executive Director of Operation Understanding DC, a nonprofit whose mission is to create a generation of leaders to promote respect, understanding, and cooperation while fighting to eradicate racism, anti-Semitism, and other forms of discrimination. We are very fortunate to have Yolanda's experience and involvement in tonight's program. Thank you, Yolanda.
Thank you so very much, Abby, for such a warm introduction. I'm Yolanda Savage-Narva, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm sitting on the tribal lands that belong to the Pamunkey, Piscataway, and Anacostia tribal communities. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here with you all tonight. Just a couple of weeks ago, we celebrated the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. And I know for myself, during this time, I think a lot about the contributions King made to making the world a better place, both as an individual and the partnerships that he had with so many other leaders. And this is also a time when there is a lot of emphasis on the relationships between the Black Christian and white Jewish communities as they stood arm in arm and fought for civil and human rights for all people in this country. While the Black Christian white Jewish relationship was especially strong, with some challenges, of course, along the way, as all relationships have, I think that's often what most people think about when they think about Black Jewish relationships. And this was a very important point in our history. But tonight, what we want to talk about is diving deeper and talking about the relationship that's even more unique. And that's the relationship within our own Jewish community. That's the relationship with Jews of color, specifically Black Jews. As we deal with the past 10 months of unprecedented events in our country, such as a global pandemic that affects us all, but disproportionately affects Black, Indigenous, and people of color, a national reckoning on race, and the latest historic event, the insurrection on the Capitol, all of these highlights point to systemic racism. So people often turn to their faith communities for comfort and support. But for Black Jews, that can sometimes be a place where your existence and presence is sometimes questioned. And it leaves you feeling confused, angry at times, hurt, and feeling like you don't have a place of belonging. Tonight, we want to dive into those feelings and experiences. We're going to talk about how racism can and does exist in Jewish spaces. We're going to talk about the gaping divide between intent versus impact. And we also want to discuss how we ensure Jewish spaces foster belonging and inclusion for every member of the community. And to help us have this discussion on this very, very important topic, our esteemed panelists tonight, and I will introduce each one of them. Kwon Crumble Benowitz currently lives and works in Washington, D.C., where she runs Chef Kwon Crumble LLC, a personal chef and catering company. She was classically trained at the Culinary Institute of America and Le Cordon Bleu, and apprenticed with restaurateur Alice Waters and Chef David Tanis at the Chez Panisse restaurant in Berkeley, California. In 2019, Kwon was the winner of the Food Network's first Ultimate Hanukkah Challenge. Kwon is passionate about family and food and uses her knowledge and enthusiasm to encourage others to cook, eat, and connect. She finds daily inspiration in her husband and their 2 children. Kwon also enjoys yoga, gardening, painting, and is a member of the Sixth and I community. She was born and raised in Philadelphia, where she graduated from the Philadelphia High School for Girls. Welcome, Kwon. And Joseph Levin-Manning. Joseph has a background in leadership development, diversity and inclusion, and human resources. In the US and abroad, he has presented to public forums on topics such as intersectionality, inclusionary practices, and community engagement. Joseph has a strong passion for diversity and inclusion, striving to bring together communities and inspiring others to live their most authentic lives. Joseph currently works at Care First, where he serves as the divisional advisor to the Chief Human Resources Officer. Joseph has a master's in human resource management from Georgetown University, a master's in business administration with a focus in organizational leadership and development from the University of Maryland, and a BA in political science with a minor in music from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. As an active participant in the DC community, Joseph founded Capital Cavellers, a group that organizes programs, events, and leadership retreats for LGBTQ Jewish young professionals in the area. Additionally, Joseph volunteers as the director of HR for Right Away, a nonprofit focused on increasing digital literacy for kids 6 through 12. Thank you so much for being here, Joe. And last but not least, Dr. Deitra Reiser. Dr. Reiser is an experienced educator and a leader in the Jewish reform movement. Deitra is the owner of Transform for Equity, an anti-racist repair group that supports organizations and leaders in building the capacity for diversity, racial equity, and belonging. She is skilled at creating space for Jewish congregants to explore race and racism through understanding intersecting identities and increasing anti-racist thoughts and actions. Her focus is on driving the necessary internal work for both individuals and institutions, which truly affect change. Her curriculum, Building Racial Stamina in Jewish Communities, has been used to further the underlying principles of diversity, equity, and belonging. She is committed to partnering with synagogues and Jewish institutions interested in moving towards anti-racism. She is an alumna of the Bend the Arc Sella Leadership Program. Deitra holds a doctorate of education and psychology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Thank you so much. What a pleasure to be here with you all. So I would love to kick this off with a question that everyone could answer. if you don't mind, and that is introducing yourselves and talking a little bit about what racial justice and equity means for you. What are you thinking about in the time and frame that we are in our history? And what is it that you most want people to know? And if I could start with Dr. Reiser to answer that, that would be great.
Sure. So when I think of racial equity, I really think about all the areas in this society in the United States that that we see disparities. A lot of the social and medical disparities. Yolanda, you mentioned the COVID crisis. We've seen the disparity there in the deaths and the sickness in the Black and Brown communities. I think of the disparities in education, the disparities in almost all our institutions, including prison and justice. And so I think of what needs to be done to get to equity. And that's really the work that I think we're all need to commit ourselves to. And in order to do that, we have to look at how each person, our thoughts, our actions, and what we are doing to not be just good and not racist, but to be anti-racist, to really work towards change. And a big part of that is relationships. And if I bring it down to our Jewish community, it's making sure that everyone belongs and has a place in our institutions.
Amen. And you described systemic racism, but you also talked about how individuals play a role in that and the importance of people understanding that they have a choice and they have a role in dismantling these systems that we're oppressed under. Thank you. Thank you so much, Deitra. Joe, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, of course. One of the things I've been thinking about lately, especially related to this question, which I struggled with wholeheartedly because there are just so many different things that come up when I think about racial justice and equity in our communities. But I've been thinking, I saw a quote recently by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. about economic justice and how that is so key and vital for our success as a community, both Black Americans as well as the broader Jewish community, and even thinking about injustice for one as injustice for all. We really need to, as you were mentioning, get to the systemic issues that are going on. And when I think about economic justice, things that come to mind for me are homelessness and mental health, and how those are two things that people are very much uncomfortable to talk about, but are so prevalent and are so important for us to do so. For me, when I was 18 and I was in college, I got kicked out for being gay. So while I was in college and I was able to thankfully stay and live on campus for the rest of, just bounce around from job and dorm to last my 4 years, I was functionally homeless. And because I was 18, I didn't know anything about the social support services that were available to me. I lived in North Carolina, so that's a whole nother host of things. And as someone who had at that point in time several undiagnosed mental health challenges, it was really challenging just to finish college, let alone figure out what I was going to do afterwards. And I've been very fortunate to have a wonderful chosen family and lots of really fantastic people who have taken the time to get to know me, to really help me navigate the world around me. Not everyone has that. And while I've been fortunate enough to do that, and that has now put me into a place of privilege, I want us to think about and remember when we're looking at the people on the corner, on the street, what got them there? Like, it's not someone who just decided that, oh, I'm not gonna become homeless today. Like, that's never the situation. And I remember for several years, I was so close to like one bad accident going and being homeless again. And it was something that was terrifying. So that's something I think about a lot is, how do we treat people who are struggling with mental health, people that are home challenged? How do we how do we treat them with dignity and respect still, and make sure that we're honoring their experience and honoring them as a human?
Thank you for sharing that with us, Joe. And I think we take for granted that everyone has a safety net in this country. And we know that that is not the case for many of our populations in our community. Thank you so much. Kwon, would you like to respond to that?
Hi. Yes, I would like to. When I think of racial equity, so where I live in Chevy Chase, it was this area was redlined, and there were no Blacks, no Jews were allowed to live here. And what's fascinating to me is that it's a pretty diverse neighborhood. So that's changed. And I remember when I moved into our neighborhood, I took my son around and introduced him to everyone, you know, just to show them, this is my son, this is where we live, we are now your neighbors. And it's just something that I thought about, that, I mean, as a mother, you're always in sort of protective mode, but I just knew I needed to let our neighbors know that we live here, we are going to thrive here, and you know, just know that this is our community. And I shouldn't have had to do that. I think it's, you know, it's sad, but and I was welcomed with open arms, but it's not something that a person that's not of color to have to think about doing. So for me, it's just more protecting. I'm always in protection mode, you know, for my family, my son, just sort of my own quality of life. So that's what it means to me.
Thank you, Kwon. It is heartbreaking to hear that, and to know that I've done similar things as well. And you're always in protection mode. And I think it's really important for us to get across to our audience tonight that that is the life we live every day, every hour of the day. We're thinking about playing defense and making sure that we're protecting the people that we love because of the color of their skin. And so that's a reality that we live with. Any other thoughts or comments around that question before we move to our next question? Okay, so I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about being a Black Jew in the Jewish community. And oftentimes being asked about your story, your Jewish journey. You know, how did you become Jewish? You know, those are some of the questions I get, and I'm sure that you have as well. Can you talk a little bit about that? What would you suggest to people who are curious about your Jewish story, how they should approach you, or if they should ask that question at all? And then there's another part to that question that I'll ask a little later, but focusing a little bit on that Jewish story and what's your Jewish journey. Kwon, can I start with you?
So my connection to Judaism is my husband, and we've been together a long time, but when we started dating, I think when we decided that we wanted to be together, that we knew we would raise our children Jewish, and we thought that was an important part of our foundation. And so I knew that I would convert because I didn't think my husband would convert. So I just started taking a workshop, and I met a really wonderful rabbi, and I became a part of a great community. And it was something that I think it took about 7 or 8 years before I decided to do it, because it's one of those things you can't go into lightly, especially if you're, my foundation was in Christianity. And so for me, it was just, I don't know, I think it was one of those experiences where I just had to let it wash over me and just become one of the things that I remember our rabbi saying is that one of the amazing things about Judaism is that it's, you know, you get to talk about it. Whereas in a lot of different religions, you just have to assume that everything is okay, but you get to sort of, the word she uses, draw shit out. And I like that, that ability to just talk about it and everything isn't just at face value. So.
Thank you, Kwon.
You're welcome.
Joe, what's your Jewish journey?
That's a really great question. I know people had some trouble hearing me before, so hopefully this is a bit better. So I have a interesting story, I would say, and the first thing I'll start by saying is the best way to ask this question, if you're trying to understand, you know, who someone is and how they've gotten to this point, is to go about it from that. You know, what is your story? You know, how did you end up in this place today? That is something I became very famous for asking when I worked for Hillel on college campuses. I would just go up to students and say, hey, how did you get here today? And, you know, of course, I ended up having to share my own background. And I would say that I have a bit of a unique background in the fact that I'm adopted, but I was adopted by non-Jewish relatives. So growing up, Christianity was the default. And it wasn't until I was in high school that I started doing a little bit of research and talking with my biological grandfather to get a little bit of sense of, you know, who are we, where do we come from, and all those types of things. And that's when I learned that my mom's side of the family, my grandmother's side of the family, were Jewish. You know, we had these ancestral roots in Caribbean Jews, you know, Sephardic, Puerto Rican, Virgin Islands, and that whole experience. And you know, I was already kind of questioning my own faith and just what does it mean to be a part of a community and what is it that I want from a community. And, you know, I was like, let me give this a try. When I got to college, my suite mate happened to be Jewish just by chance. And I remember that year we had an electric menorah, put it in our window and like light it each night. And we went to the Hillel on campus for a Hanukkah party. It was a highlighter themed party. So it was, you know, wow, weird. But the one thing that I remember specifically from that night, I forget exactly who asked me the question, but the question they asked was, are you Jewish? At that point in time, you know, I was very early in my own Jewish identity development and had no real concept of what it meant to even be Jewish. So my response was, I'm Jewish. And I said emphasis on the ish because I don't know, like I know I have Jewish ancestry and like a Jewish family, but in terms of the actual Judaism itself, I don't have a strong connection to. Nowadays, people in my community don't realize or even recognize, or they just assume that I've grown up Jewish because I have done a lot of things. But you know, one of the things I always try to say to people is you never make the assumption. You don't know what someone else's experience is. And one of the things I tell my friends, and I'll wrap up here, is the three things I always say to people whenever they ask me how do I handle that question is, you know, I start by telling them, no, I didn't convert. No, I'm not Ethiopian. Yes, I'm adopted, but not exactly how you think. Because, you know, we have these preconceived notions of what someone is going to be based on the color of their skin or the particular room we meet them in. And you just really don't know. So if you need to ask a question, just always go from it. What is your story? How did you end up here today?
I love that. Thank you so much. Deitra.
I like that and I don't like that. And I'll tell you why. I think the basis is spot on, right? People want to know, we want connections. And the big thing of what Joe was just sharing is coming from a place of not assuming who people are. Unfortunately, there have been so many Black Jews and Black folks in Jewish spaces who have been asked the questions, are you Jewish? Are you Jewish? How are you Jewish? Why are you here today? Looks of not quite being accepted. And so a lot of Black Jews and Jews of color have this feeling of not being welcomed, not belonging. And so what I like to tell folks is that whenever you're in a place like this and people are sharing their story, it is a great gift. It is a gift that each person has individually chosen to give. And thank you, Kwon. Thank you, Joe, for sharing that gift today. In the course, the facilitated discussion groups that we're running, the Building Racial Stamina in Jewish Community, we really emphasize that you don't ask those questions until and unless you, one, are willing to share your story, and until and unless you are building a relationship, that you have reached out in friendship or in partnership, that you are really working at getting to know someone, because people's stories are personal. And again, so much hurt has been done to Jews of color for people asking those questions. And those questions for so many people have felt like this arm pushing them out the door, out of the community. And so for us to circle our arms around all our folks, I really ask that people wait to even broach that topic. Share yourself, start a relationship, and don't ask the question. Obviously, that's also a personal, different people have different opinions, but I do know, and I've heard it from many people, that it often feels like this arm pushing them out the door.
Thank you, Deitra. Thank you all for answering that question. And I think it's a sensitive one. It really is. And I think that maybe I shouldn't make an assumption that you feel this way. I'm going to dive deeper with another question. Do you think that that question is rooted in racism? Is that question rooted in this idea that the Jewish community is X? And if someone who doesn't fit that description walks into a synagogue or some communal space, then that's when the questions start to flow. Any comments on that? Okay, Deitra?
Yeah, I do think that there is an assumption or a bias that Jews look a certain way in certain communities. So I have spent a lot of my time in reform spaces, some conservative, not very many Orthodox. And when I've talked to other Jews of color about their experiences, and believe me, it often comes up, how there is a disconnect, this feeling of, yes, this is my community, I'm Jewish, I belong here, and I'm not always I'm not always made to feel as if I belong here. So I think that assumption is based on race. And when I said earlier that it's not enough to be a good person, it's not enough to not be racist, To be anti-racist, we have to really think, where is this assumption coming from? And how do I flip it to make it anti-racist? And so the anti-racist thought is, of course, anyone who comes in this door, I'm going to assume that they are part of the community, that they are Jewish. That is the anti-racist thought when we're in community.
Joe?
Yeah, no, so I would definitely agree with that. I think that for a lot of people, it's not going to be obvious why that's such a racist thing, or where that they're even making the assumption. I think this is a great example of where we have microaggressive behavior, something that seems very innocent on the forefront, but is rooted, as you were saying, in that deeply into like some kind of bias that we have. I think back to when I was living in the Moisha House here in DC. I was hosting an event like I did all the time, and a person, a non-American, I won't go into their specific nationality, but they came up to me and said, "Hey, are you Jewish?" And it's like, I live here, did the introduction to this event. I just led us through a blessing. How and why is this question coming up? And it goes back to that idea of just, you come in with an expectation of who is going to be there and what they're going to look like. And to the point of people not necessarily always feeling like they're there. One of the things that I talk about and I've challenged people on all the time is, when we're saying things like, oh, they're half Jewish, or oh, they're a quarter Jewish, what are we doing qualifying someone else's Judaism? It's the same thing. Like you're ascribing a value to someone's identity, ascribing a value to how they have a relationship with their own community and or their faith. And it's the same thing. And so wholeheartedly agree.
I will add one more thing. There are people in my synagogue that I have known for years now, and I have never asked their story. I have talked with them on the phone, and I have not asked their story. And I think that speaks volumes. If they ever offer their story, I will gladly accept it. But I just really, I think about that sometimes when this question comes up. And those are other Jews of color, just to be clear.
Sometimes I wonder, or when someone approaches me with that question, I look at them and I say, why do you want to know? Are you asking because it's going to make you feel better? Are you trying to hurt me? Are you trying to tell me that I don't belong here? Are you trying to tell me that my son doesn't belong here? Are you trying to tell me that that I made a wrong decision in taking this journey? I mean, there's so many things that you're instantly on guard again. I mean, I think that's sort of the thread of a lot of, when you're in a community that's not typically a community you would based on the color of your skin that you would be a part of. There's always, they have to put you in sort of a category and say, well, you belong over here. And this is a constant thing, I think, in the Black community, that we're always, I don't think as Black Americans that we have time to put people in boxes. That's not our thing. I think what we've been there, we know that story. I think it shouldn't be an us and them kind of thing. It should be, I'm here, I'm worshiping with you, I'm a part of this culture, I'm a part of this religion, this is something that we're all doing together. And why do you want to know? Like, where is this coming from? Do you want to feel better, like you're better than me, or that you were raised Jewish and I chose to be? So there's this funny little thing that happens, where you, and sometimes you want to share it and sometimes you don't. But I think if someone doesn't approach you from a place of love or compassion, it's very difficult to share your story.
Very true. Do you think, because we live in America, we live in a system that's rooted in white dominant culture and white supremacy, and it's been that way for 400 years. How do you think that the American story impacts and influences what happens within the Jewish community?
I'll say something very brief to start. I think back to when I went to grad school the very first time and did not finish because it wasn't the right fit. But the class I took was the history of Judaism in America. And my final paper was written about the relationship between the Black community and the Jewish community. And I talked about how, for Black people, especially during the Civil Rights Movement, the Jewish community, the Ashkenazi white Jewish community, was oftentimes seen as the face of the white community for them in terms of the interactions that they were having. When we think about some of the professions that they had and the ways that they were relegated to because of the Protestant community, the Protestant and Catholic communities rather, and because of the specific interactions they were having, there's a lot of whiteness ascribed to them, even though they weren't necessarily a part of the majority. And I think if you look at American history, it's to how you started off earlier, Yolanda. We have the people that came over and kind of conquested the land, and then as each different wave of immigrants came in, they were considered othered until they became assimilated into the white community. So I think about the Italian community, I think about the Irish community, and so on. And I think that it's the same thing here. We're kind of going through the instance where we have what we've considered to be the typical Jewish community, and now we're starting to become more aware of the diversity that exists in it, and slowly we're welcoming other people inside. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done. And I think the one thing I'll add, and I think it's relevant to the last thing as well, is being thoughtful and intentional about the way that people's identities overlap and intersect. I think about this, especially being a queer Black man who's inside the Jewish community. I'm oftentimes the only person of my identity in a room, which is fine. I've come to accept that, and I don't fault any space for that. But when we're thinking about who and what are we trying to build here, let's be sure and be careful that we're thinking about who is not here, who have we left out.
That's powerful, Joe, and so important. Looking around and seeing who's not at the table is really important. Deitra or Kwon, any thoughts about that question?
I should have taken notes on what you just asked.
I'm happy to ask it again. Just under the umbrella of this white dominant culture and white supremacist system that we all live under, how do you think that impacts the Jewish community and their interactions with Jews who are Black in their community and Jews of color?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Joe said again. And I think that raising just how in this society we breathe racism, we breathe it, it's in the air, it's in the water every day. And so none of us escape it. None of us. And so when we think about that and we think of how the country has really taken anti-Blackness from the start and has built upon that from the start till today. We're thinking about the racial reckoning and the insurrection. So that is in our Jewish community as well. And it's in the Black community. I mean, that's the thing about breathing this air, that no one escapes it. And so it really is about finding ways to think about actions and thoughts and recognize that anti-Blackness and then be pro-Black in our thoughts, in our actions, in our Jewish community. And just like Joe said, looking around and seeing who's not at the table and then asking the question why they're not at the table. And so when we think about that percentage, and what a wonderful thing that at the beginning we were told that there is 9% people of Jews of color in the DMV, but that was likely an undercount. And we know that was likely an undercount because Jews of color have started doing this work. They've started counting us. And so it's knowing that we have this community out there that is not within our communities, right? They're not in these white Jewish dominated spaces. And so it's really asking the questions, how can we, in our synagogues, in our institutions, what is it that we need to do to open our tent, to make sure that we are a place that people of color want to be?
Thank you, Deitra. And, just a couple of things that you pointed out, I want to make sure I highlight, and then I want to ask Kwon if she wants to respond to the question. I think is this important part that you pointed out about kind of the institutionalized racism that permeates even people who have the same skin color, that because this system is created with white dominance and supremacy, that even people who are oppressed are also internalizing racism and oppression as part of contributing to the overall system. And that's an important thing to point out. And that's why it's, and Dr. Ibram Kendi, I think, points this out in his book, where he also was a part of that system at some point, and that this is something everyone is working on, becoming anti-racist and, having that pride to promote Blackness as something that is beautiful and it's not something that's othered. And I think that's a really important point. Kwon, would you like to respond to that question? Kwon said, I'm gonna leave it there. Joe, sounds like you want to say something.
Yeah, I have two things. So one of the things that you just mentioned made me think about the different instances where there have been shootings at synagogues, and how the initial reaction is always, we need to have more police presence in these synagogues. And there isn't really much thought given to what impact is that going to have on the broader community? Who comes now who might stop coming as a result of this? I remember very vehemently on Facebook, not necessarily the best medium for conversation, but trying to help people to understand that if your first reaction is that we need to have more weapons in a space, and that's how you expect to combat violence. One, I mean, the data shows that that is not what helps. Two, when you're thinking about the people in your community, have you really thought about what their needs are and how you can best have that conversation about what those needs are? And then the second thing that this brings up for me is erasure. So I think about a very particular phrase that I'm sure many of us have heard before. Oh, I'm not white, I'm Jewish. And to me, that is one of the most gut-wrenching, cringeworthy, like infuriating things I can ever hear. You're telling me that just because you happen to share a Jewish identity with me, that somehow equates to
Blackness amongst the group, as well as anti-Semitism. Do you think that there's a reckoning in a way within our Jewish community about the impact of racial inequities and racial disparities? And do you see a shift happening at this point?
I do see a shift. And I think it's going along with the greater shift in the country, that people who are white are waking up to what Black people and brown people have known and have lived for years. And just a desire to really take a deep dive into race and racism in individual selves and in our institutions. I also see this desire to want to do, and I want people to do. I want them to be co-conspirators. I want them to be allies. I also, before jumping in, I want people to take stock and see where their blind spots are. We all have blind spots. And so, you know, there's work to be done in so many ways, and in our Jewish institutions as well. And I want to make sure that people are going about it in a way that's not going to cause more harm.
Thank you, Deitra. Kwon, do you see a shift happening? What are your thoughts on that?
You know, I don't know. I think it's funny. When I talk to my friends, and I don't have a very large Black community here in DC, but I have a really strong friend group, and I think when so many of these, the George Floyd murder, and everyone was calling, you know, me and apologizing, you know, for something or anything, and I'm wondering, like, why are you calling me? I mean, what do you want me to do? It's more, I can't do anything. I'm living it. You know, I've done everything that I can do. Not everything, obviously. There's so much work to do. But there were friends who were white who were calling, and they were upset. And I'm like, this is Tuesday. This is Wednesday in a Black person's life, every day walking out and feeling unsafe, you know, and everyone's just, people are waking up, you know. I think white people need to talk to their white friends about what's happening, not just calling me and trying to get me to be supportive of them. It's like, we've been telling you this all along, and all of these things are happening. This is what this country is built on. It's the ideology. I mean, that's everything that this is, we've been living it. So, I mean, do I see it? I don't know. I mean, I'm cautiously hopeful that things will change, but it's not going to happen. It won't just happen in my community or in the Black community. It has to happen with white people changing their minds about, you know, this is not we're all human, you know, we can't just keep, you know, there's nothing sustainable about this. And that's why people are so upset, because where are we going with this? And what are you trying to prove? What are you holding on to? And where is your hate coming from? You know, like, what is it about me that you hate so much? You know, is it resilience? Is it perseverance? Is that I continue to rise, you know, because even through all of this, look at the election. The election, in my opinion, was won by the Black community, you know, because they went out and they voted, and they were encouraged to vote, and their voice means something. That gives me hope. That is my little glimmer of joy that I find each day, that there are people out there who still believe in the greater good. So maybe, I don't know.
To be continued, huh? Yeah. Joe, can you wrap us up with this question?
Yes. So there were two things that have come to me. The first is related to all the protests and things that happened over the summer, and getting messages and calls from people as well. And some of them were like, you know, hey, how's it going? Others were calling and talking about what it's like in their cities. And I wanted to comment on a specific text that I got from someone telling me to stay inside, to stay safe. And it bothered me. It took me a while to realize what was it about it that made me feel so uncomfortable. But then I realized, who are you to tell me what I can do with my body? That is what people are out there protesting right now. Just to have the right to exist. Who are you to tell me that I should keep myself indoors? And while I appreciate the sentiment that you want me to be safe, but think about the other message that you're sending, the other message that's coded in here. And does it make sense for me as a Black person to be out there and to be protesting? Maybe, maybe not. But that's a decision that I make for myself based on like my own personal beliefs, what I perceive to be safe or not safe for myself. I don't need and or want or appreciate someone trying to tell me what to do with my body. That's the whole entire reason we're out there protesting. And the other thing is, and I think, Deitra, you were talking about this, we can't stay silent. And I do think, and I do believe that the Jewish community is making strides in the right direction. There's obviously a lot of work left to do. And I think things like tonight are doing that work. We're putting in the effort. You have to have someone who's willing to have the conversation, someone who's willing to host the conversation in order for it to happen. And I think that, it is no longer okay just to say that you didn't know, you didn't hear, because you have opportunity now. You have YouTube, like you have so many places and opportunity to self-educate that you don't have to burden others to try and educate yourself, to educate you. And I think that, and I think this is true also in the corporate world and in private practices, you can't just be a good person. You can't just say that, we aren't actively engaging in anything, so we're fine. Or, oh, we're a business, so we should not be commenting on something like this. Like, this isn't a matter of being political or not. This is not a matter of, oh, we are worried about like this being representing our business badly. This is a matter of what's right and what's wrong. This is something that's simple, like it's black and white. It's, not to be reductive too much, but I mean, that's what it comes down to. You're either on the side that is pro equity, or you are not, and you're saying that there are some people who are worth more.
Thank you all so much. I do want to give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions, so I'm going to turn my attention to our chat and start with the first question we received. And this question is really around terminology and language, which I do think is very important, and and understanding exactly what something means helps us to know exactly what we're fighting and what we're up against. And so this question asks about the difference between bias and microaggression. Does a bias equal a microaggression? And then what's the difference between bias and or prejudice? So maybe taking that first chunk of that question, does bias equal microaggressions? Maybe a good place to start.
I will first also introduce you to a newer term for microaggression, which is racist abuse. So instead of the word microaggression, when you hear it, you might think that it's small, the slight, and that's not really how it was meant, the definition. However, it's often how it's interpreted. And then if we get rid of language that's a little more ambivalent and just say racist abuse, that was verbal racist abuse. I think it takes, it's more descriptive of what it is we're talking about. So yes, you can be biased and you cannot perpetrate a racist abuse or a microaggression. What does happen sometimes is that our biases allow us to give up racist abuse. And it goes back to what we first talked about, the intent versus impact. It may not be your intent to say something that feels like racist abuse to someone, but it was the impact. And so oftentimes when a Jew of color hears, "Are you Jewish?" especially after, especially after, clearly showing that they are Jewish, like Joe was telling in his story of, welcoming to a clearly Jewish house and saying blessings, and then having the racist abuse of saying, "Are you Jewish?" So the bias was really the thought that, oh, this Black person can't be Jewish. That doesn't fit with with the schemas, with the thoughts in my head. But the racist abuse was then asking. So it is different. Do you have any other things to add or other thoughts?
Deitra, I think you answered both of those
Okay.
beautifully. I appreciate that. I think you got to both parts of that question for sure. And so there, Joe, go for it.
One, thank you for introducing me to that new term. Have not heard that before, but I do like it. And it actually made me think about something I read a couple of years ago, and it relates to the language that we use around prejudice, bias, privilege, and all these types of things, and how it is catered to the white community, how it's made it simpler and easier for them to digest what's happening, and how that does a disservice to the experience, to your point of the impact that it's having on other people. So I just wanted to comment on that. It was a really interesting article, and I'm glad to hear that conversation still happening.
That's an important one. Let's see. I think we have quite a few questions, and so please just jump in if you want to answer any of these. So the next question is really about a policy question around how do Jewish organizations, institutions, synagogues, in terms of policies, begin to make sure that everyone who walks through their doors feel as if that they, that's their community and they belong there. Are there any recommendations on what can be done?
I'll start. I would say coming at it and thinking about it from a policy perspective is the wrong approach. I think whenever we put things down on paper, we bring into question interpretation. We're giving people license and opportunity to say, well, this is what I think they meant, or I think this is what it means. And what we're really trying to do here is encourage the right behavior and the right attitudes to people. And so what you're really needing to focus on is like simple things like, how do we get people to shake the bias of what someone who walks through these stores should look like? And how are we going about having the conversations where it's like, oh, I see something happening, and so I'm going to intervene and try and protect this person from having that racist abuse happen toward them. These are the types of things that I think should be the focus, not policy. And when we're on the topic of policies, I think if we are looking at and trying to understand what policies that we have and what is the impact that they're having, we need to think about what are the biases that are written into these policies. This isn't just about race. It could be about gender, it could be sexuality, or any of these types of things. We need to go through and audit all of these policies and understand, what language are we using here and who does that impact? Is this accessible language for people? And accessibility is so many more things than just a ramp. So.
Thank you, Joe. Kwon, you have any reactions to that, or we can move to the next question?
I was just thinking about, I think certain, I agree with Joe. I don't think it should be a policy, but I also think that things come from the top. So if, let's say, a rabbi sort of equates the experiences of the Black community with the experiences of the Jewish community, anti-Semitism, anti-Black experiences, it sort of takes, they're both very different experiences. One is sort of rooted in, you know, sort of our history, and the other is sort of this, it's rooted in this hatred that based out of religion and so on. So it's just like, if from the top, like, for example, I'm sorry, let me go back. You know, you read tons of articles about different diasporas of Judaism, you know, whether they're in Uganda or Ethiopia. And a lot of these communities have made, are, you know, going to Israel for birthright, you know, and not being accepted and being stopped at the airport and turned around, you know. So these things don't just come from, this is not just this isn't just happening. This is coming from somewhere, from the top. And I think that whether it's the, you know, I think it should be, I'm not sure if I'm explaining it the way that I'd like to, but I think that there has to be someone who is of influence to say, this is, Judaism has been spread the influence has been spread all over the world. And there are people of all colors who have embraced this culture and religion and should be accepted. And that should be the case in the synagogues. That should be the case in Israel. That should be the case anywhere. If anyone wants to be a part of the community and has accepted these things that have been taught, like sort of brought out and taught to these countries, it's like, so where is all the bias coming from? If it comes from the top and says this is our community, then where's the problem? You know, why are we not, just because of the color of their skin, they're not Jewish, you know, or they're not accepted because of the face of Judaism is the Ashkenazi Jew in America who just happens to be white. But that's the tip of the iceberg of Judaism. There's so many contributions all over the world that can contribute to the body of Judaism, in my opinion. So I don't know if that answers the question or not.
I do think that's something that's lost a lot, that Jews have always been multiracial, multi-ethnic. I mean, we have always been a multitude of many. And I for whatever reason, like Kwon was just saying, when people, especially in the United States, think of Jews, the thought of a white Jewish person comes to mind.
That's an interesting question. And I wonder if part of that, at least for the United States, is the founding of Christianity in this country and the roots of that. And the United States being one of the countries that the labor and everything around us was built on the backs of enslaved Africans. And just thinking about how that all started for the United States and how slavery was actually something that was used to actually racialize people. That happened afterwards. And so just thinking about the different roots and ideologies of countries and how those have differed along the years, I think may have a huge impact on how we view race and racism in this country today. And the system of caste that has been built here, as well as India and Nazi Germany, the ability to kind of racialize groups of people and then use that as a weapon for destruction and oppression. And that actually segues into another question that we got around trauma. And this question is a really important one. And it's asking if we could talk a little bit about the intersectionality of holding both trauma from your experience as a Black person, and also trauma from your experience as a Jewish person, and how does holding both of these identities impact you, even, you know, if it's a negative impact or maybe a positive impact.
That question makes me think of my reaction when I was watching the insurrection on the 6th. I mean, that is what I kept thinking. Oh, I am surprised at my reaction. I'm not surprised that it's happening. I was surprised at how angry I was. I was surprised at how, just angry doesn't quite describe it. And I don't think that there are strong enough terms to describe how I felt that day in polite language. And it was because of those dual traumas. And then stacked on it, the institutional systems, those systems that allowed that to happen. So yes, the trauma is real. And we know from research that trauma is intergenerational. So my children have that trauma in their DNA from their Ashkenazi Jewish side and from their Black side. I don't have the Jewish trauma in my DNA, but now I might, because I believe I have some of my children's DNA in me in a different way, right? But maybe not in my DNA, but certainly in how I process and those feelings that I have. And just thinking about what Joe said earlier about mental health and the challenges of mental health in the Black community and in the Jewish community. I mean, there are challenges that go unspoken and go untreated. And as a school psychologist, I see it with in the schools, I see it in the children. And so it is something that we as a community really need to hold and to think about ways to lift it up so that we're paying attention to it.
I want to say that I think in the Black community, I don't think we recognize trauma, or are not allowed to, especially as a Black woman. I find that I'm expected to be strong or fierce or, you know, just unmoved by something. And I have to continue to persevere. And while I find those traits to be, you know, admirable, you forget that you're also broken and bent and fractured inside while you're still holding up your community. And I continue to do, obviously for my children, I have to be strong, but, you know, I didn't think, you know, I've talked to my sisters and they don't, you know, maybe there's times that they probably needed some type of mental health intervention, or any Black woman that I know probably could use someone to talk to who could understand the Black experience. But no, you know, I didn't know until later on in life that I should see someone about these little things that sort of manifest themselves. You just don't know where something's coming from. And then you just realize that it's just this constant fear, or this constant guard, or this constant need to protect yourself and still be strong for everyone else, you know, while you're still trying to rebuild yourself and be the glue. I can't be the glue if I don't have all those things I need to, you know, to hold myself together. I can't even hold myself together, but I'm carrying you and I'm carrying this and I'm answering all your questions and I'm helping my white friends understand why this is happening in this community. And it's just like, at some point, I mean, where am I getting all of my, you know, my help? Where's my self-care, you know, time? And I don't think in the Black community, we think that we need that. And there's so much trauma. There's so much, you know, this PTSD that I see in my father, who's a, you know, Vietnam vet. There's so many different things that you're carrying. He's in Vietnam, 18 years old, can't have a cocktail, can't vote, or you know, like, I think it was either 18 or 20. Anyway, he couldn't vote and he couldn't have a cocktail, but he's over there fighting a war. So imagine what that's like, you know, to always be strong for someone and then not know that you need help and then not have the resources to get it, you know, and so on and so on. And it just perpetuates this cycle of like, well, you think you don't deserve it, or you think you don't need it, or you can push through it without it. And we're expected to do so. And that's not fair, you know, so the trauma continues, which is really unfortunate. And again, it's a part of your DNA and you just keep passing it on.
That's truth, Kwon. You just keep passing it on and piling it on. Joe, what are you thinking?
So something that comes up for me in this space is the way that I've seen Holocaust education happen in the Jewish community. I see such an emphasis on the Jews who were murdered during the Holocaust and no mention of all the other groups that were impacted or affected. And I think, and I've made this comment to people, you know, as a gay, Black, Jewish male, there were 3 different categories I would have fallen into during the Holocaust. 3 different ways that my life could have changed or been impacted, whether that be jailed, murdered, had scientific experiments run on me. You know, there's so many people that were impacted by the Holocaust in so many different capacities that we do ourselves, not just ourselves, but the entire world, a disservice by not having an open and frank conversation about that. I would pay for someone to prove me wrong in the fact that there was no one who overlapped categories. There's no way in the Holocaust, there were not people who were Black and Jewish, that there were people who were not gay and Jewish, or people that were Black and gay. We have to understand and accept and realize that intersectionality is a real lived experience, and we shouldn't just use it as a buzzword. We have to be thoughtful and intentional about the way that it's fused into everything that we're doing. And I am a firm believer that the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, accessibility, this isn't something that needs to just be we're going to build an office and they're going to focus on this. No, this is something that needs to be ingrained into every single thought and action and policy move you make. You can't just think that, oh, I'm going to, you know, put on my accessibility classes today and I'm going to focus on this. No, it's all interconnected. It is all, it's all affecting us all the time.
It is. Thank you all so much. I wish we could talk for the next hour, because there are so many questions and there are so many themes that I think we're tapping into, but to be continued for sure. I do want to ask one question of each of you before we close, and that's basically this. If you could leave the audience tonight with one thing, with one takeaway, what would that be? What would that one thing, if you could share just one that you want to leave the audience with? And I'll ask you to just chime in when you're ready to answer that.
My one thing is to be anti-racist is a moment by moment choice and decision. And so saying that, falling back on the fact that I'm a good person or that I'm not racist is not good enough. It really is continuing to educate myself, to be in community, and to be anti-racist, to if I'm having a thought that's racist, to really bring that thought to awareness and think of what the anti-racist thought is, and to make anti-racist actions. And that's on a personal level, and it's on an institutional level. We know that institutions are people. And so in order for us to change the systems, we have to have the people within institutions be anti-racist. So it's an action.
I would say my one thing is to be courageous. Being courageous is such a multifaceted thing and requires so much of us at one time. I think part of it is related to being honest with ourselves and being gracious enough to admit our own mistakes. We are all human. We all have bias, and that's okay. How you address those biases, how do you, act upon them is what matters. Whether that is to, sit there and be passive and just let something happen in front of you, or to actively engage and be anti-racist in that moment. You can't be so afraid of yourself that you aren't able to act. And the other piece I would add to that is you have to be honest and self-aware enough to know when you need to take a moment and step back. And that's both to step back to let someone else, their voice be heard, because that's what's most appropriate in that moment. But even more importantly is to practice self-care, to practice empathy and grace for yourself. This is a marathon. All of us can tell you this is not something we woke up and we were just like, we're going to do this today, and going to make a 50-yard dash and it's going to be finished. I'm going to sit here and write out a paper and it's going to be finished. No, we're going to be doing this for probably the rest of our lifetimes, and really working on to eventually one day getting there. And so you need to take care of yourself now so that you can continue to pass the mantle on going forward, not just amongst ourselves, but also to future generations.
I just want to say to everyone, speak up, in all settings, if all white, all black, wherever, anything that you hear that is anti-black or anti-Semitic, speak up, take your place, your voice will be heard. You have to say something. It's important that we all, if you hear someone say something that's inappropriate, check them, stop them, educate them. That's one thing I hate doing is I feel like I have to educate everybody. And there's millions of resources to find out, how the atrocities of our nation. But speak up. A lot of times when you don't have skin in the game, someone's going to listen to you. It's usually the ones that are in the struggle that are, always persecuted. But if it's not your struggle, jump in. We need you.
Wow, I heard be anti-racist, be courageous, be honest and self-aware. And then Kwon said, speak up, speak out, do something. And so I want to share a quote with you, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it. And in honor of MLK's birthday, I think it's one of his most famous quotes, but I think it's very relevant to where we are right now. And it's that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it tends to bend toward justice. And lately I've been adding a little bit of my own thoughts around that. And I'd like to add a challenge to that. And it's not enough for the arc to just tend to bend. We gotta actively get behind it and push it. Some of us gotta get in front of it and pull it to actually move us to where we wanna go. And so I leave you with that challenge tonight. I thank you, Kwon, Deitra, and Joe, for a thought-provoking, vulnerable conversation. Thank you so much. And I will turn it over. Jane, thank you.
Wow, thank you. It is such an honor to be here to conclude tonight's conversation. Yolanda, Kwon, Joseph, Deitra, thank you for an extraordinary program tonight. It was riveting, thought-provoking, honest, and frankly, humbling. Really, thank you. To everybody that showed up tonight, thank you for being here with open minds and open hearts, your deep questions. Tonight's turnout is a testament to our community and its commitment to real listening and learning. I'm so proud to be part of it. Thank you to Federation, Women's Philanthropy, and specifically to Abby Cherner. Every program she does is from a place of excellence and curiosity, leaving us all enriched for the better. Tonight was no different, and then some. Thank you, Abby. In session 1, we heard from Reverend Tim Werner and his family about the Black experience in the DMV. And tonight we homed in on the Black, Jewish, and Jews of color experience. One of our goals tonight was to challenge our perceptions in order to build a collective understanding of the role that race plays in our community. Another goal was to learn how we can foster belonging and inclusion and how to make our community radically welcoming. Tonight, we learned so much that it will inform our actions going forward on both accounts. I know I have. Being sensitized to the importance of relationship before asking somebody's story. Being anti-racist is about relationships. We do have blind spots. The impact of trauma. Drash it out. I like that one. In practice, this in fact isn't easy work. And another takeaway for me is that we should approach it with perseverance and patience. I learned new things tonight, and we may make mistakes. We may require forgiveness for ourselves, for others, no shame. But as Jews, it's our obligation to keep at it. So of course, this is not the end, just part of a process. And we hope you'll join us for the third and final session of this series. Information about the third session will be going out in a follow-up email, which will also include resource materials, book recommendations, and other valuable information. So be on the lookout. One final takeaway is to continue to learn and engage in conversations like these. What I heard tonight is that one of the most powerful ways for us to create the communities that our speakers spoke about tonight is to have brave conversations with all the people in our lives. So here's to having brave conversations, to continuing to do this work together, and to droshing it out. Thank you again to everybody. It was an extraordinary evening, and have a good night. Thank you.